Welcome to the Israel-Palestine report. We're going to be talking about a lot of the major developments in the last week, particularly the fact that this has been the deadliest week in the Gaza Strip in the region of Israel-Palestine since essentially the ceasefire was declared between the sides just over a month ago. We're going to talk about what happened during this last week, why has this been such a deadly week, and where do things stand right now. We're then going to look at a couple of different facets that have been developing over the last week and where do things stand. Among them, we're going to look at the implementation of phase one in the hostage agreement between the sides. How many bodies of hostages remain held in the Gaza Strip? Has the Rafah crossing been open? Who has violated the agreement, in which direction, and where do things stand? We're then going to talk about what is happening in the Gaza Strip on the ground in terms of how are things developing? Is Hamas still rebuilding its military strength, its governing powers, and where is the IDF located in the Gaza Strip? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what is happening in phase two of the agreement. As a reminder, this is only phase one, and phase two is supposed to be a much broader agreement, an end to the war, an Israeli military withdrawal, and the complete revamping of the Gaza Strip and its rebuilding with a different government that's not led by Hamas. And at the end, I'm actually going to talk about an arena that has been somewhat forgotten, but has been flaring up in the last week, which is the arena between Israel and Lebanon. In the last week, we have had a flare-up of the fighting between the sides, and there's also been a lot of developments with regards to the Lebanese military saying that it is not going to be able to disarm Hezbollah. We're going to talk a little bit about that right towards the end. As a reminder, this is your first time joining. You're watching the Israel-Palestine Report with Professor Alon Burstein. I am a professor of political science and an Israel Institute fellow at Tufts University. Feel free to send in your questions in the live chat throughout our discussion. I do, however, have one question that I constantly repeat. One request that I constantly repeat. If you have a question, please preface it with the word question or Q so I know that it's a question, not just a random comment. Because as I read through the comments as I am talking, sometimes I will miss something if it is not marked that way with a question. So with that, again, one of the things we're going to start from talking about is what is happening in the Gaza Strip with regards to the deadly week that has been, before moving on to some of the other developments. Two more things I want to say on some sort of personal caveats. Those of you who are following my channel know that I have moved recently. I'm currently setting up the office. One of the things some of you may notice is I'm using a new microphone. If you do not hear me, or if there are things that I have done that I'm doing that you cannot hear or see me perfectly, I'm currently in the process of setting up my office. So if you have any advice actually as to better lighting, we can't hear you well, etc., different seating, feel free, send it into the chat. I'm always happy to hear what people are actually thinking with regards to how I can better deliver what I am trying to deliver, which is essentially the most unfiltered and direct news about what is going on in the Israel-Palestine arena. So with that introduction, thank you to those who are already saying, see you and hear you. Thank you. With that, I'm going to start with a rather depressing development of the last week, which is the deadliest week in the Gaza Strip since the ceasefire was declared. Up until now, the last 2 years, I'm used to saying fighting has happened here, fighting has happened there. But over the last month and a half, there's been much more reports about the implementation of the deal. However, there's been a couple of breakdowns of the ceasefire in the last several weeks. And specifically, over the last week, there had been a major breakdown, and it was the deadliest week on both sides. Just as a reminder, already in the previous week, before last week, the week before this, we already had the first signs that the ceasefire was on shaky ground as far as the militant action was considered with both sides. Already in the middle of October, we had several violent incidents that occurred with Palestinian operatives opening fire and detonating explosives against IDF soldiers that were positioned in Rafah, that is the southern area of the Gaza Strip over here, and in Khan Yunis over here. And in both those incidents, we had IDF soldiers, Israeli military soldiers, that were killed or injured, and Israeli retaliations leading to a lot of Palestinian deaths. So we've had that development over the last I'll say 2 to 3 weeks. And throughout that time, what we have seen is an increase in the pace of these violent incidents. We saw on October 19th an incident in Rafah. Then on October 21st, there was an incident in Sajaiya in northern parts of the Gaza Strip. And then on October 25th, there were other incidents in Han Yunis. And each time, what happened was an incident of Palestinian operatives that either opened fire on IDF soldiers or detonated explosives. And Israeli military retaliations. In one case, on the 25th, Israeli military initiated an operation in the areas of Nusrat refugee camp. In all of those cases, there was a flare-up. We had people injured or killed on both sides. And then very quickly, the negotiating countries, the United States, Qatar, Egypt, Turkey, all intervened and things died down. And that's where things were sort of stable leading into this week. Now, at the beginning of the week, there was a lot of controversy between the sides with regards to the return of the bodies of hostages that are still held in the Gaza Strip. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later when I'm going to talk about the implementation of phase one. So for now, I'm just going to say that throughout Sunday and Monday, there were already a lot of disagreements between the sides with regards to, is the deal being implemented in good faith and who is violating what side of the agreement? And this came to an explosion on Tuesday of this past week. On Tuesday, October 28th, in the neighborhood of Janina in Rafah, which is this area over here. It's this area in central Rafah on the southern parts of the Gaza Strip. And one of the reasons that's important is that this is an area that is controlled by the Israeli military. It's not an area that has this power vacuum that Hamas has taken over, but rather it's an area that's controlled by the Israeli military. And therefore, each time there's a violent incident that erupts there, it is happening within the area that the Israeli military has said it is already cleared of Hamas operatives. In that area, on Tuesday, October 28th, the Palestinian unit emerged seemingly, according to intelligence reports in Israel, from a tunnel and fired 2 anti-tank missiles at Israeli soldiers, engineering units that were engaged in activity in that region of Rafah. And this was followed up by sniper fire against those same Israeli military soldiers. As a result of this, 1 IDF soldier was killed and several were injured. Now, importantly, Hamas immediately issued a statement saying they have nothing to do with this. And this is a pattern that Hamas has been developing over the last several weeks. Whenever there is a violent incident that occurs against the Israeli military in the Gaza Strip, these are typically happening in the areas that are controlled by the Israeli military. And so Hamas is building off of its deniability. It's building off its deniability and saying, look, we don't control that area. This area is controlled by the Israeli military. This is not one of our units. You can only complain to yourselves. You're the ones who are still occupying that area. So Hamas immediately issued a statement saying they have nothing to do with this, and this was not one of their units. Despite this, it is, I will say, very likely that Hamas does have something to do with that attack. And despite this, Israel immediately launched a major retaliation, both diplomatically and militarily. Diplomatically, Israel said that it is going to change the terms of the agreement between the sides. The agreement between the sides included the redeployment of the Israeli military in the Gaza Strip to a specific area known as the Yellow Line. Israel said it is going to now change that. It is going to invade the areas that are controlled by Hamas and not stay within the boundaries of the Yellow Line. So that was something Israel announced. But the much harsher response was a military response. Immediately after that incident, Israel launched massive airstrikes throughout different areas of the Gaza Strip. Some of these occurred in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, in the Sabra region of Gaza City. Others occurred in the central parts of the Gaza Strip, in Al Nusrat refugee camp and Al Bureid refugee camp, all in these central parts of the Gaza Strip. And there was also massive artillery fire that was reported in the areas of Han Yunis in southern Gaza, as well as an airstrike in Han Yunis that targeted a car, seemingly an assassination attempt, killing 5 Palestinians. In total, in all of those attacks, 104 Palestinians were killed throughout that span of 24 hours, and upwards of 250 were injured. And that's what made this the deadliest week in the Gaza Strip since the ceasefire had been declared. The Israeli military said that it targeted primarily Hamas operatives and operatives that had been part of the Nukhba forces that actually carried out attacks on October 7th. According to the Israeli military, upwards of 30 armed operatives of Hamas and of different organizations in the Gaza Strip were killed in those airstrikes. The Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip reported that 104 Palestinians were killed. So As I always say, we don't know the exact numbers. The Palestinian Health Ministry reports 104 people killed. The Israeli military says upwards of 30 militants killed. Possibly that is 30 militants out of 104 people. But again, that's speculation on my part, combining those two numbers. At this point, all we have are those two reports. I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about how many people have been killed since the ceasefire in total. But that is what happened all within the span of Tuesday, Wednesday. What is more importantly, with regards to the future, is how the negotiating countries responded. And in this, we saw the response of both sides, Qatar and the United States, both activating essentially to make sure that they rein in each side that they can have some control over. Qatar immediately condemned the attack that Palestinian operatives carried out in Rafah. They said that Hamas has said that they are not responsible for this, but that Qatar doesn't know who's responsible or who is not. But no matter what, such an attack is a violation, and they call upon the Palestinian side to stop any such attacks from happening. In turn, in the United States, immediately the United States issued a lot of statements saying that while they expect Israel to respond to the violation of the truce and the Palestinian attack, they do not want Israel to say all bets are off and the ceasefire has collapsed. U.S. President Trump specifically put out a statement saying nothing will endanger the ceasefire, and adding that while Israel has the right to retaliate, quote, Hamas is only a small part of the deal in the Middle East, end quote. So Trump was immediately saying, while Hamas violated the deal, Hamas is only a small part of the larger deal. And that's a seeming way to call Israel to not break down the entire agreement between seemingly Israel and the Palestinians or the wider Middle East because of Hamas's violation. Also importantly, despite the fact that Israel announced that it was going to expand the yellow line and encroach upon the Palestinian area in the Gaza Strip, very quickly, the United States announced publicly that they do not approve of this, that they are against Israel expanding and changing the yellow line. And in Israel, the country backed down very quickly. There were conflicting ways that the country tried to do this. They said initially that it was actually the United States that wanted that line change, but then the United States changed its mind. Whatever the accurate story is, the fact is that by day's end, Israel responded militarily, but it did not actually change the status quo on the ground. And by Wednesday, the sides had again decided and declared that the ceasefire between them is now back in effect. So we had this momentary breakdown on Tuesday, which seemingly was contained. But at the same time, if we look at this as part of a trajectory, if we look at what happened last week, an attack that happened in Rafah, basically in the same area that happened in the Janina neighborhood, with the same type of attack, a Palestinian unit emerging with anti-tank missiles followed up by sniper fire. And then later on, we had another incident in Han Yunis, and then this week, this incident in Rafah. This is by now seeming like a buildup. Again, now looking at this from the analytical perspective, it seemed like a gradual buildup and a breakdown of the ceasefire as the sides are increasingly using either a faster pace of different attacks throughout the Gaza Strip or harsher retaliations throughout the different areas of the Gaza Strip. But no matter how we look at it, the fact that the sides declared that the ceasefire had resumed as of Wednesday should not make anyone think that now the sides are actually committed to the truce. The truce is on very shaky grounds. I'll say just since Wednesday, we have also seen another attempted attack that happened of Palestinian forces in Han Yunis. We also had reports in the last 2 days that the Israeli Navy had carried out attacks in the areas of Han Yunis and in the areas of Gaza City. Other reports of artillery fire. All is to say that if we look at the last 2 weeks, by comparison to the previous 2 weeks, we are seeing a lot more fighting that is happening in the Gaza Strip amidst the truce. The negotiating parties seemingly each time come in and say, no, don't break it down. But at the same time, the sides are constantly pushing the envelope even further. So it remains to be seen how this is actually going to develop. And this is going to come back to us when I talk a little bit about the implementation of phase 1 and what is happening in the negotiations between the sides when it comes to phase 2. But the opening story of the last week is fighting is intensifying in the Gaza Strip, despite the fact that the sides are in an official truce. And if you're following the trajectory of this war long term, that is cause for concern when it comes to hopes for if the truce and ceasefire are going to continuously develop towards a long-term agreement or not. Right now, it's on more shaky grounds than it was several weeks ago. With that, I'm going to take a pause here and do this first section looking at the deadliest week in the Gaza Strip since the declaring of the ceasefire. And I'm going to look at a few questions. So, I am seeing one question. Is there a division inside the Hamas leadership, inside and outside Gaza, about phase 2? It's an excellent question coming in. Again, I'm going to repeat it. The question is there a division within the Hamas leadership with regards to implementing the next phases of the agreement? At this point, the internal leadership in the Gaza Strip is not at all as strong as it was previously under Yahya Sinwar or Mohammed Sinwar. In the past, we have seen a big disagreement between the external leadership of Hamas residing in Qatar and sometimes in Turkey and Syria, and the internal leadership in the Gaza Strip. However, since the assassination of Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Sinwar, the internal leadership in the Gaza Strip is not actually as strong. The internal leadership right now is seemingly under the command of Izzadin Haddad. He is a military figure. He is in charge of the Al-Qassam brigades. He's not a politician. He, according to reports, says this about himself. He is not a politician. And so, with the external leadership, led, essentially it's a committee, but essentially led by Halil al-Hayya and Halil Mashal, are the ones that are dictating how the negotiations are going to happen. But meanwhile, the internal leadership in the Gaza Strip is, in rhetoric at least, going along with them. Are they actually, is the external leadership aware of what is happening as far as the military operations in Gaza? That we don't know. But at least in terms of rhetoric, there is no disagreement between the sides because the internal leadership in the Gaza Strip is viewing itself much more as just the military wing, not the political wing that is engaged in any of the negotiations. Looking at some of the other questions here, I am seeing, again, so I'm going to read this out. Question: what was the problem with Prime Minister Bibi getting permission to enter an area in Israel? Tuned in on Fox News topic at the ending. So I want to talk about that a little bit later. Please remind me, Warrior, if I do not address that question. I will talk about that a little bit later, about the visit of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to the U.S. base that has been set up in Israel. I'm looking at some other questions. With Hamas rebranding itself and morphing into a more political and infrastructure posture, is there a scenario in which they can be rendered non-influential in the future management of the Gaza Strip? So, the question that came in, and I'm going to paraphrase that a little bit, is with Hamas rebranding itself into more of a political and infrastructure mechanism, is there a scenario where they are not actually the ones that are part of governing the Gaza Strip in the future? According to Trump's plan, the vision for the Middle East, 20-point plan, yes, Hamas is supposed to not have a governing position in the Gaza Strip. However, as I'm going to talk about very shortly, Hamas has been working very hard to ensure that even if, in principle, it is not in the position of power in the Gaza Strip, in actuality, it will be the ones pulling the strings of the future government, a government that is not part of Hamas, but will still be a government of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Hamas is working very hard to ensure that they will be the ones pulling the strings behind that government or technocratic leadership in the Gaza Strip. So theoretically, yes. In theory, Hamas can declare, we do not want any part of the government in the Gaza Strip. In fact, they have openly said that they are willing to not take part in the governing mechanisms of the Gaza Strip. But in actuality, it is very unlikely that Hamas will agree to simply disappear from the scene. It is much more likely that Hamas will try to continue to have its influence in the Gaza Strip, but only from behind the curtains. They will try to pull the strings of unaffiliated politicians that will become the new leadership in Gaza. But again, that's looking far into the future. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Gaza shortly, but that's looking far into the future. Looking at some of the other questions, why do the United States appear determined to have Israel's enemies provide security? How does Qatar view Israel? So the question that's coming in, essentially is, why is the United States relying on different Arab countries to provide security for Israel? Essentially, when we look at the way the deal is structured, the deal between Trump and the different Arab countries has been about securing a new mechanism of government in the Gaza Strip. On the one hand, there is supposed to be a dismantling of Hamas and a disarming of Hamas and achieving some sort of peace and security within the Gaza Strip. On the other hand, there's supposed to be assurances to Israel that there will be no further arming of Hamas and no terrorism threat. And then there's a question of how could that be assured? And one of the things we have to remember is that Trump is very, very adamant that the United States troops, U.S. troops, will not be deployed into war zones. And so Trump is trying to essentially outsource the different security apparatuses within the Gaza Strip. Who is going to be in charge of security and who is going to give Israel that sense of safety? And one of the ways that has been done is to suggest that it will be these other actors in the Middle East that will provide security in the Gaza Strip. I want to talk about that a little bit in a minute. But that is the reason why we're seeing Trump negotiate with different Arab countries about providing security in Gaza. At this point, it's unclear where that's going to go. But again, I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm taking a look at a couple of the other questions. What were the Palestinian people doing wrong for Hamas to execute them? So a question about the infighting between Palestinians, Hamas, and militias. I'm going to talk about that also soon. Okay, so with that, I'm going to think I've answered most of the questions about this topic. I want to take a short breath if anyone else has any other questions about what has happened in the Gaza Strip in the last week with regards to fighting, before I turn to the next topic that I'm going to talk about, which is where do things stand with regards to implementing the deal? Looking at phase one of the deal, the return of hostages and release of Palestinian prisoners and detainees, and where do things stand with regards to how each side is living up to or not living up to the implementation of phase one, and looking into the next phases of the deal. So, short break if anyone else has any questions. Giving another 10 seconds. Any further questions? Cool. Okay. So I will say that one of the text messages I got from someone who was watching and Warrior is asking, are my children up? Thank you for the question. They are not at this point. My children are both asleep. Let us hope that stays that way. And one of the other comments that I got offline was that I'm speaking too fast. I think that is just a product of not holding the microphone. So I'm a little bit not used to that. So thank you to my friend who, thank you. Sorry. Other comments, someone saying they missed the sound of my children in the background. One day, they too will be talking about this. Of course, there'll be peace in the Middle East by then, so they won't have to. So I'm going to try to slow down a little bit. If there are any, again, I will say again, I'm currently setting up my office and where I'm recording these things. So if anyone else has any constructive comments as to how you how this could help benefit you more, in terms of also visuals of the maps or etc. If you think there should be different things, feel free, write that into the chat. I'm really happy to hear any comments and advice. This is done in order to try to give you as clear information as possible. So please feel free to share any thoughts that you might have. So I'm now looking at the second thing that I was going to talk about, which is the implementation of phase one of the deal. Where do we stand right now? Just as a reminder, in phase one of the deal involved 5 different things. It involved the truce between the sides, the release of all living hostages and the return of the bodies of all hostages in the Gaza Strip, the release of all Palestinian prisoners and detainees, not all, forgive me, the release of a certain amount of Palestinian prisoners and detainees, and the return of the bodies of Palestinians held by Israel in exchange for those hostages, the Israeli military redeploying in the Gaza Strip, the entrance of humanitarian aid into Gaza, and the opening of the Rafah crossing, the crossing between Gaza and Egypt, for the flow of Palestinians between the sides to leave the Gaza Strip. So, where do things stand? First of all, with regards to some of those aspects, all of the live hostages have been released, so there's no more live hostages in the Gaza Strip. Israel also, in turn, released up close to 2,000 Palestinian prisoners and detainees. And one thing I'm going to say as a caveat, I've had several questions about the terminology that I use, Palestinian prisoners and detainees versus Israeli hostages. So I'm hoping to put out a video in the coming days, possibly next week, about terminology, why I call one side hostages and one side prisoners, and the distinction between prisoners and detainees. But that video will hopefully be coming out. And in addition to that, there's also been the massive increase of humanitarian aid coming into the Gaza Strip. So as far as the deal has been developed so far, we've had the release of live hostages, the release of Palestinian prisoners and detainees, Israeli military redeployment, entrance of humanitarian aid into Gaza, and the truce, I mentioned already, has been on shaky ground, but has been in effect. What remains as far as the implementation of Phase 1 is concerned in the Gaza Strip are two things. One, the return of the bodies of hostages that are held by Hamas and different organizations, and in turn, the opening of the Rafah crossing. Now, when the ceasefire between the sides was declared, there were 28 bodies of hostages that were held in the Gaza Strip, and Hamas immediately said that they cannot return all of them. They said that some of them, they don't know where they are, and some of them are buried under the rubble of the massive bombings that happened in the Gaza Strip. In turn, Israel said, well, if that's the case, it is also going to not live up to everything that was supposed to be part of the deal. It is not going to authorize the opening of the Rafah crossing between the sides. Israel also said it's going to stop the entrance of humanitarian aid into Gaza, but very quickly the United States told Israel they can't do that, and therefore Israel at this point is only stopping the opening of the Rafah crossing. So what happened over the last week? With regard to the Rafah crossing, almost nothing. The sides keep on negotiating. The Palestinian side and the Egyptian side are all saying that they are prepared to open the crossing. In turn, Israel is saying as long as the bodies of hostages have not been returned, the crossing is not going to be opened. With regard to the bodies of hostages, until the beginning of this week, 15 bodies were returned, leaving 13 bodies of hostages held in the Gaza Strip. Throughout the last week, there's been a lot of push and pull between the sides, a lot of pressure of the negotiators on Hamas to return more bodies, and in turn, a lot of statements from Hamas explaining why they can't return more bodies, or if they might have returned more bodies. There's been also one major development with regards to the search and excavating of the bodies of hostages in the Gaza Strip. Already on Sunday, there were the first reports that a new deal is brewing, and Hamas is negotiating with the Red Cross and the negotiators to say it knows the location, the potential location of bodies of hostages within the Gaza Strip, but those bodies are within the area that is controlled by Israel. Again, Israel controls roughly 55 or 58% of the territory in the Gaza Strip, the area that's known as within the yellow line. And Hamas was saying it might know the location of some of those bodies, but it needs to go into that area that is controlled by Israel. As a result of that, under massive pressure from the United States, Israel agreed to allow Hamas militant units, the Al-Qassam brigades, enter into the area that is controlled by the Israeli military in the Gaza Strip. The Israeli military actually withdrew from areas in Rafah, in Han Yunis, and in Saja'iyah, southern Gaza and northern Gaza, and allowed Al-Qassam units to come into that area with representatives of the Red Cross in order to start searching for bodies and excavate them within those regions. This started on Sunday, and on Monday, Hamas announced that it had located the body of a hostage in northern Gaza and returned the remains of that body to Israel. In Israel, the body was then sent to examination, and it was determined that it is not actually the new body of a hostage, it is actually the remains that are associated with an Israeli hostage that was already retrieved, upwards of 2 years ago. More than that, on Monday, the Israeli military published footage that it took from a drone showing that Hamas had planted those remains during the excavations. They didn't actually dig up the body. They, in fact, dug a hole with heavy equipment, then brought in the remains and planted them in that area and told the Red Cross, see, we found this. All this led to a massive uproar within Israel and led to international condemnation of Hamas, as well as condemnation from the Red Cross. And I'll say in a caveat, this is also associated with the breakdown of the ceasefire that happened on Tuesday that I talked about before, because this all happened as part of this week's trajectory. This all happened on Monday. Then, after we had the breakdown of the ceasefire and the flare-up and the die-down, the negotiators again received messages from Hamas that there are possible locations in Rafah that they might know where hostages are buried. And even though in Israel there was initial rejection of the idea that Hamas is again going to go into the area controlled by the Israeli military, Israel did agree to this under pressure from the United States. And on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, there was footage that was released of Hamas operatives accompanied by the Red Cross coming into areas of Rafah, coming into areas of Han Yunis, in order to attempt to excavate the bodies of hostages. So all that has happened during the last week, and that's one of the major developments. So we've had the Israeli military withdrawing from certain areas and Hamas going into different areas in order to theoretically excavate those bodies. Then, yesterday, October 31st, Hamas announced that they have returned 3 bodies to Israel. This happened after the day before they returned 2 bodies to Israel, and all this was being examined by the Israeli forensic teams. The 2 bodies that they had returned the day before were in fact identified as 2 Israeli hostages, and so at this point there were 11 bodies that were remained. Now Hamas said that they returned 3 bodies, and they were being examined by the Israeli forensic team in the last 2 days. However, earlier this morning, on November 1st, Israel announced that the 3 bodies that were returned are not Israeli hostages. They are the bodies of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip that Israel was now going to return. So Israel said Hamas is again toying with the deal and toying with the negotiators and deliberately returned 3 bodies that do not have anything to do with the negotiators. Then Hamas put out a statement saying that they had found 3 bodies and that they had requested that they only send a sample of the DNA of the bodies to Israel to see if they are bodies of hostages. Israel said no, they demand to receive the bodies, and that's why Hamas returned those bodies, and that's where things went wrong. So that's what both sides are saying with regards to the current situation. In addition to that, however, earlier today, again on November 1st, the Al-Qassam brigades issued another statement. They said that they are prepared to excavate all the remains of Israeli hostages that are held in the yellow area, in other words, in the area that is controlled by the Israeli military, in order to end the issue of hostages' bodies once and for all. They also added that they urged the negotiating countries and the Red Cross to bring in heavy equipment and to negotiate with Israel in order to allow the excavation of those bodies within the yellow area in the Gaza Strip. In turn, Israel said that it knows that Hamas is capable of returning between 4 to 6 bodies already, and is simply not doing that. The Israeli military also said that they suspect that Hamas is using those invasions, so to speak, the entry with the Red Cross into the yellow area, in order to access different weapons caches that Hamas still has in the area controlled by the Israeli military, or possibly to set up those units that are carrying out the attacks, and that Israel is going to deny this request because it suspects that Hamas at this point has the ability to return more bodies. At this point, that's where things stand. It is a complete stalemate between the sides with regards to the return of bodies and the full implementation of phase 1 and the opening of the Rafah crossing. 3 out of the 5 elements of phase 1, the return of live hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners and detainees, the Israeli military redeployment in the Gaza Strip, and the entrance of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip, are being lived up to. In turn, the opening of the Rafah crossing, Israel is not allowed. The return of all the bodies of hostages, Hamas is not delivered. And the truce between the sides seemingly being maintained broadly, certainly by comparison to the death rate of Palestinians throughout the last 2 years. This is a much lower death rate, so it's being maintained. On the other hand, since the declare of the ceasefire between the sides, beyond upwards of 230 Palestinians have been killed since the ceasefire has been declared, and upwards of 5 Israeli soldiers and roughly, I'll say close to 24 Israeli soldiers, 5 Israeli soldiers have been killed and nearly 24 have been injured. So the ceasefire, again, is broadly being maintained, but there's some cracks in the foundation of that as well. So that's where things stand with regards to phase 1. And very importantly, I'm going to talk a little in a moment about what's happening in the Gaza Strip in the meanwhile, but that's the reason that we're at a complete stalemate. Because phase 1 says these things will be completed, and then we'll move on to phase 2. Meanwhile, these things aren't completed. There's no time frame for when they need to be completed, and so things are completely stuck at this point. Next thing I want to talk about after I take a break and look at a few questions is, so what is meanwhile happening in the Gaza Strip while these things are stuck? But at this point, I want to take a break and look at a few questions. A friend was a cameraman and told me lighting with persons. Okay, this is a question. This is a comment about lighting, so I'll look at that a little bit later. A warm review. A lot of comments about the lighting. Thank you. Yes, I'm using new lights right now, so I'm still working on them. But thank you for all the comments. I promise I will look through them thoroughly. Other comment. I'm really wondering what Israel got out of the last 2 years. The whole world was telling Israel that they couldn't get Hamas to disarm and that they wouldn't be able to rescue most of the hostages by force. Excellent question. Question is, what has Israel managed to achieve over the last 2 years? And as I want to talk about shortly, Israel has managed to, as far as it's concerned, destroy a lot of Hamas's infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. This came obviously at the expense of destroying the vast majority of the Gaza Strip itself and destroying upwards of 80 to 90% of the infrastructures in the Gaza Strip and between 70 to 80% of all the buildings and homes in the Gaza Strip. But at the same time, as Israeli intelligence itself is showing, Israel has not managed to destroy Hamas's military wing. It has not managed to disarm Hamas. So as far as successes in the war goes, Israel does claim that its military pressure has brought Hamas to a certain element of agreeing to release the hostages within this framework. But Israel certainly cannot claim that it managed to destroy Hamas's militant capabilities or governing capabilities in the Gaza Strip. And whatever successes it did have, obviously, again, came at the expense of the population in the Gaza Strip. Another comment that I'm just going to read out loud because I feel like it. Alon, you are the most informative breakdowns. Thank you. Thank you for that comment. Other comments about, again, the lighting. Okay, I promise I will take a look at all these comments because clearly there are a lot of people have what to say about the lighting, and I appreciate that. Question repeat. Why did Prime Minister Bibi not have access to the area in Israel? I promise, Warrior, thank you for repeating the question. I promise you I am getting to that. I think it may even be, no, it's not the next thing I'm getting to. I'm getting to it in the next topic after the 2 topics from now. I'm going to talk about why Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu had to ask for permission to go to somewhere in Israel. I promise I'm getting there. Pausing here for a moment to take a drink of water and hear about any other questions. Take a look at the connection here, make sure my battery holds up. Forgive the technical moment. All this is part of still setting up the office. Okay. Next thing I'm going to talk about. With all this, we've had the breakdown of the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip and then its restoration to some extent. And we've had what is happening in phase 1. Meanwhile, while phase 1 is being negotiated, implemented, happening, not happening, what is happening in the Gaza Strip as far as the fighting sides. What is the Israeli military doing? What is Hamas doing? So, just as a reminder, the demarcation lines right now are what's called the yellow line, the line that separates where the Israeli military controls and where there's theoretically a power vacuum, and I'm going to talk about what's happening there on the Palestinian side. That line goes around roughly here. The Israeli military controls this entire area that is between this area and the border of Israel, going roughly along this line over here, and then all of the town of Rafah and half of Khan Yunis. All that area to the east is controlled by Israel. To the west, there was no clear explanation as to who is supposed to control it. As a result of that, in the areas that the Israeli military is controlling, the Israeli military is still engaged in military operations. This does not involve a lot of fighting. It does involve a lot of excavating Hamas tunnels. It involves a lot of detonations of buildings that are associated with what is called terror infrastructure. It involves flattening of certain areas. All this is happening, meanwhile, in the areas that is controlled by the Israeli military. In turn, in the areas that are controlled by the Palestinian side, according to the deal, according to the framework, Hamas is no longer supposed to have any governing capabilities in the Gaza Strip. However, what happened with this stalemate between the sides is a de facto power vacuum. There was a de facto situation where no Palestinian entity had any governing control or powers in the Gaza Strip. And as a result, immediately, on the moment that the ceasefire was declared and the Israeli military withdrew, Hamas began to reassert its control in those areas in the Gaza Strip that the Israeli military withdrew from. Hamas has since then been rebuilding and reaffirming its control in those areas, and is doing this at three different levels. One is administratively on the ground. Hamas has rebuilt its governing apparatus. It started from appointing 5 governors to administer the different areas in the Gaza Strip. It then started to develop its more municipal infrastructure and start to actually appoint mayors to the different towns, regions, and general locations in order to start providing social services. We have to remember that in the Gaza Strip, the vast majority of the area is completely destroyed. But the overwhelming majority of people have no home to go back to. The need for basic social services, the need to have everything from how do we set up certain sanitary conditions, reestablish sewage lines, all the way to how do you distribute humanitarian aid and provide food to the population, are all things that are desperately needed in the Gaza Strip. It's not just people going back to their lives. And Hamas is the only one that is setting up any municipal governing apparatus in order to do that. So they started to do this both from governing structures as well as municipal apparatus. They've also, in the last week, started a much more effective mechanism of collecting taxes from the merchants and tradesmen in the Gaza Strip in order to fund their activities. So all this is happening on the governing level. On the international level, Hamas also has been engaged in negotiating with the different negotiating countries in order to make sure that it gets a foothold in what is the future of the Gaza Strip. According to Trump's deal, within the Gaza Strip, you're supposed to have a technocratic government that will be established, that will be made up of Palestinians, and Hamas is supposed to have nothing to do with this. However, according to multiple sources, Hamas selected at least half of the 15 names of Palestinian technocrats that are supposed to be the future government of the Gaza Strip. And according to, again, those reports, Egypt and Qatar know about this. They knew, and the United States knew that Hamas was engaged in this. This list has then been submitted to Israel and since then has gotten stuck. Israel never gave its official response. But Hamas is engaged both on the ground, reestablishing its governing power, as well as engaged internationally. Meanwhile, on the military front, Hamas has been engaged in 2 things. First, it is reestablishing its security control over the Palestinians by fighting those militias. This relates to the question that I was asked earlier. Earlier, I was asked, what did the different Palestinians that Hamas was hunting do to deserve Hamas hunting them? I'm not talking about if they deserve or not deserve, but as far as Hamas is concerned, Anyone who takes up arms in the Gaza Strip that is not part of the Hamas apparatus is seen as a rebel, is seen as someone who should not be allowed to govern any territory in the Gaza Strip because that then endangers Hamas's military capability. Similarly, other militias might have cooperated or collaborated with Israel during the war, and as such, Hamas is hunting them down. So on the one hand, one of the things that it has been doing is very, very actively engaging Palestinian militias in order to ensure that no one else can have any militant strength within the Palestinians except for the Al-Qassam brigades. At the same time, Hamas has been very busy at rebuilding and redeveloping its military wing for a possible future engagement with Israel. And in this, I'm just going to draw back on the report that was given by the Israeli intelligence. Israeli military intelligence issued a report on October 20th, estimating what is Hamas's militant strength as of that day. And it said, October 20th, 2025, 2 years after the war, it has said, or 2 years since the war began, it said that Hamas currently has roughly 20,000 fighting operatives in the Gaza Strip, hundreds of rockets, including medium-range rockets that can reach the center of Israel, thousands of RPGs, over 10,000 guns, 6 divisions, and 24 partially active battalions. It also said that over half of the tunnels that Hamas had active prior to the war are still active and not been destroyed. So, with that, I return to the question I was asked before. What did Israel achieve over the last 2 years? Like I said, Israel is claiming that it destroyed Hamas's governing capabilities in the Gaza Strip and through its military engagement destroyed most of Hamas's terror infrastructure and brought it to the point where it is willing to negotiate the return of hostages and possibly a disarming. In fact, what we are seeing currently is that Hamas is very active in reestablishing its governing capabilities and powers in the Gaza Strip, and it is far from defeated militarily. So, not up to me to say how do we measure success of Israel or Hamas in the war, but I will say any claims that Israel has managed to disarm or defeat Hamas militarily have to be taken, to very large extents at least, with a lot of grains of salt. With that, that is the end of the third section that I'm going to talk about, what is happening in the Gaza Strip. The next thing I'm going to talk about is looking at the implementation of the future phases. How is this going to relate to what is the future of the Gaza Strip? The last thing I want to talk about is what's happening in Lebanon. But as always, I'm now taking a pause for questions. Let's see. Comment. Professor Free. Question. Any further info on smuggling via drones from Egypt? I've heard 40 to 50 incursions per day. So there's a lot of news that is breaking about different militant activists that are trying to smuggle weapons from Egypt into Gaza. At this point, I will say none of the news that I have seen is very substantiated because most of the statements that are being made by politicians. I'm not saying that politicians never tell the truth, but I am saying that all the politicians that are stating there are 40 to 50, some are saying over 200 smuggling attempts per day of weaponry into the Gaza Strip via drones or other attempts are all being made by politicians that also have a political interest in saying that. That's not, again, I'm not saying therefore they're lying, but I'm saying I am waiting to see a report from either activists on the ground or military intelligence of Egypt or of Israel or statements of Hamas that would relate to anything with regards to these smuggling attempts of weaponry into the Gaza Strip. At this point, yes, I agree, there are a lot of reports with regards to what is happening on the smuggling arena of weapons, but it's hard to trust them at this point, I would argue. Pausing here and giving them room to questions. Other question. Next question. Is aid now flowing 100% rate into the Gaza Strip? Since the declaring of the truce between the sides, the amount of aid that has come into the Gaza Strip has exponentially increased. It was at a rate of, depending on the time period, 100 to 200 aid trucks per day. Now it is nominally at the rate of upwards of 600 aid trucks per day. I say nominally because each day there are problems. Each day there is fighting that erupted in this area near the border crossing, and therefore it turns out that trucks cannot get through that day. Or this day, there's a breakdown in the chain of command between Israel and the United Nations, and therefore not as many trucks get in, but nominally 608 trucks come in per day. Most days, that is in fact what is happening. What we are seeing with regards to the humanitarian front in the Gaza Strip, on the one hand, we are seeing that there is a lot less of a food shortage in the Gaza Strip, and I use that term deliberately because I'm not going to say there's an abundance of food in the Gaza Strip, but there's less of a shortage in the Gaza Strip. We're seeing markets, according to different reports of Palestinians on the ground, marketplaces have a lot more to offer in the Gaza Strip, and prices are going down on the one hand. On the other hand, the entire economic infrastructure in the Gaza Strip is destroyed. Employment does not really exist. All the employment that is offered, I'll say in a caveat, tends to be through the governing apparatuses, i.e. through Hamas. So that's a bit of a catch-22 with regards to how do we want to see the economy jump-started in the Gaza Strip. So there is more aid into Gaza and there is more food in Gaza, but how is it actually distributed to the population still has a lot of question marks hovering over it. At the same time, we're also seeing one of the things that Hamas insisted in the negotiations and the United States agreed to was that all of the aid be distributed through the mechanisms of the United Nations, not through the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. That means that all the aid is coming in through UN agencies, and within those agencies is a lot of controversy as to if Hamas has any access to that aid itself. The United States itself published images from a drone it has in the Gaza Strip in the last 24 hours, showing Hamas operatives violently taking over at least one of the aid trucks in the Gaza Strip. Now, that's one aid truck out of, I was saying, somewhat 600 every day. So I'm not saying, hey, look, Hamas is taking over all the aid. I'm saying aid is flowing into Gaza. How much of it Hamas is managing to actually take over for its own purposes? How much of it is being distributed to the population? And then from the population, how is it actually getting to the ordinary citizens rather than to the marketplaces, which then the people may not have enough to buy? All that are still questions that need to be answered. But there is more aid coming in, and the situation is being improved very, very incrementally. Looking at other questions. Okay, so as I said, the last two things I want to talk about, and I'm happy to take at the end any other questions if someone wants to ask about a specific topic, but the last two topics that I wanted to talk about relating to the developments of the last week. The first is, where do things stand with regards to the implementation of phase 2 of the agreement? All we're talking about is phase 1. What does phase 2 include? Phase 2 includes far-reaching things. It includes a complete disarming of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, i.e. not just disarming, but also destroying all the tunnels, removing all weaponry from the Gaza Strip, the establishment of a technocratic government in Gaza, Hamas not being part of the governing apparatus, the Israeli military withdrawing from the Gaza Strip, and the establishment of an international stabilization force, ISF, that is going to be made up of other armies, that's going to take control of the Gaza Strip, and also the development of a Palestinian police force. It's unclear, it's very unclear what is going to be the role of the ISF, the International Stabilization Force. Is it supposed to be peacekeepers that are made up of different countries that come in and just enforce the peace? Are they supposed to disarm and demilitarize Hamas and engage Hamas militarily? Are they supposed to protect the Palestinians if Israel attacks again? It's unclear. At this point, in Trump's plan, it just says there'll be the establishment of this international stabilization force. What it's supposed to do, we don't know at this point. How is this looking on the ground? With regards to the establishment of a technocratic government, there has been, as I said, the selection of 15 Palestinians whose names were selected by different Palestinian factions, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority primarily. This was submitted to Egypt and Qatar, and then that list was submitted to Israel for approval. So theoretically, that is moving forward. However, it got stuck there. No one said anything about if Israel approved or not. It's simply gotten stuck. Israel has said it's not going to engage in phase 2 until phase 1 is complete. Phase 1, like I said, I related to before. So that's in terms of the establishment of a technocratic government. Similarly, the Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip is not going anywhere until the implementation of phase one as far as Israel is concerned. In fact, on the contrary, as I said, Israel now said it is going to invade further into the Gaza Strip beyond the yellow line. The United States stopped it. So Israel's not withdrawing anytime soon. The only thing that has seemingly moved forward in the last week or two has been thinking about that international stabilization force. Some negotiations that have developed. And this relates to the question that was asked before about the U.S. base in Israel. After the first breakdown of the ceasefire, the first major breakdown happened on October 19th, the United States announced that it was establishing the Civil Military Coordination Center, CMCC, Civil Military Coordination Center. This was going to be established in an area in southern Israel, in Kiryat Gat, and was going to be a center established by CENTCOM in order to support stabilization efforts in the Gaza Strip. Essentially, it's supposed to be a logistical center to look at how phase two is implemented and how we move forward, as well as to monitor the ceasefire between the sides. So this is a U.S. base that was established in Israel in order to supervise what is happening in the Gaza Strip. Within 3 days that it was established, there were reports that a series of countries had sent their soldiers or representatives of the country to that base in order to negotiate with the United States what is going to happen in the future of the Gaza Strip, among others. On October 24th, it was reported that soldiers from the United States, France, United Kingdom, Spain, Australia, Greece, and Cyprus were all in this civil military coordination center in Israel. And as well as alongside them, there were representatives from Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Germany, Canada, Denmark, and even the U.S. ambassador to Yemen had come to these negotiations. So all this is happening, and the United States is seemingly orchestrating the development of some sort of regional or international coalition to think about what's going to be the future of the Gaza Strip. One of the things that I want to emphasize is who is noticeably missing from there are Palestinian representatives and Israeli representatives. The fighting sides, once again, are not part of this negotiation. Much like when this truce and ceasefire between the sides was imposed by the United States and different Arab countries, here once again, within the CMCC, we are having all kinds of countries negotiating under U.S. auspices without Israel or Palestinian sides actually there. Israel did appoint a representative. Michael Eisenberg was a business person who was going to be Israel's representative in this base. However, since then, he was also fired by the Israeli government because of internal politics, because according to reports, he was associated with Naftali Bennett, who is a political rival of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Either way, Israel does not have a standing representative in that base that is located within Israel that is supposed to negotiate the future of the Gaza Strip. Neither does Hamas, obviously, or the Palestinian Authority. So, over the last 2 weeks, since the establishment of this base in Israel, we have had a series of U.S. officials, from Vice President Vance, Secretary of State Rubio, the head of the Joint Chiefs, lots of different emissaries, Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, all coming to Israel to talk to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, also to talk directly to the Israeli military, and to visit this base. This ended up breeding a lot of pressure on the Israeli government, saying, have we lost control of what is happening in the Gaza Strip? Have we surrendered control of our security to the United States? And this relates to the question that was asked before. In response to this pressure, at the beginning of the week on Monday, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu stated that no, this is all being done in coordination between Israel and the United States. And as a result, he wanted to go visit this base and show a presence and have a photo op in this base of the United States in southern Israel. However, since it's a U.S. base, he doesn't have authority to go there. So, as a result, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu had to ask for permission from the United States to go visit this base in Israel, and he received it, and he went to this base on Wednesday and stated that this is all being done in coordination between Israel and the United States. However, despite his statements, I am going to say, with regards to the future implementation of Phase 2 in the Gaza Strip, at this point, the sides are not negotiating. Israel and Hamas, and even the Palestinian Authority, are not engaged in any negotiations as to what's going to be the future. What is happening is the United States is talking to lots of other countries in the region and internationally about a potential future military force that is going to take control of certain areas in the Gaza Strip once the Israeli military withdraws from there. But it's unclear when this would happen. Would Israel have a veto? Does Hamas or the Palestinian Authority have a veto? Who has a say as to who participates in this international force? Trump has said that Qatar will be part of it. Israel has said in the past that Qatar is an enemy state. Trump has said Qatar will be part of it. Israel may say no. Israel said it does not want Turkey to be part of any military force in Gaza. The United States said to Israel that Turkey will be part of this future force. So we don't know. And what will be the mandate of this force? Is it going to be something that, again, is there to disarm Hamas? Is it going to be something that's there in order to protect Israel? Is it going to be something that's there in order to protect Palestinians? We don't know at this point. So as far as the implementation of Phase 2 goes, there's a lot of talk happening with regards to a possible future government, and a lot of talk happening with regards to the implementation, the development of and deploying of some sort of future force in the Gaza Strip. But the technical questions as to what will this actually include, what will be the mandates, who will be part of this, at this point, far from any agreement. Pausing here, look at questions before addressing the last thing I was going to talk about. Question: would you agree that the exclusion of the warring parties, the appearance of neutrality is maintained? So the question that's being asked is it possibly in the interest of neutrality, or does it help neutrality by excluding the warring sides? It's a very interesting perspective to ask that and to suggest that maybe this is in order to help negotiations. I would say that at this point, on the one hand, yes, it does seem like if you just have the other parties negotiating, the parties that are not fighting, you might get a more neutral and impartial stance. At the same time, this is something I said, I believe in my live stream even last week. What we have here is a situation where Israel and Hamas are currently in a truce and a ceasefire. They did not actually come to that agreement themselves. Negotiations often happen as a result of prolonged discussions between sides, and the sides come closer and closer together until eventually they come to an agreement. And then they may have some interest in also living up to that agreement. That didn't happen here. Here the sides were just as stubborn. Each one had their red lines they were not going to cross. This deal was imposed on them. Trump negotiated with a series of Arab countries, even in the peace conference that declared the end to the war. Those who signed were the United States, Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, not the fighting sides. The fighting sides never actually signed that the war is over. Other people signed. On the one hand, that seems to be the only way that this war might have been over. So maybe that's a trajectory forward. On the other hand, that also means there's very little commitment of the fighting sides, and there's very little political desire of the sides to show that they have any commitment to this because it was imposed on them by both sides. So there's some advantage to not having the actual warring sides at the negotiating table. At the same time, I'll say there's also glaring disadvantages, because without the sides actually coming to the point where they recognize that they are in agreement, and instead it's being imposed upon them, they are then constantly going to look for ways that might find loopholes in the agreement. And that's what we're seeing with the constant potential breakdowns of the truce, and where both sides are not fully living up to what they're expected to live up to in Phase 1. Taking another moment, if there are any more questions on this before turning to another arena, that's the last thing I'm going to talk about, what's going on in Lebanon and Hezbollah. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is an arena that has, I would argue, somewhat been forgotten, but is still one of the major arenas of this war, and has also had its share of flare-ups in the last several months, and that is the arena between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. So as a reminder, it was just over a year ago that Israel and Lebanon reached a truce and a ceasefire. Prior to this, in September, October of 2024, Israel carried out a massive invasion of Lebanon. There was massive fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. Hassan Nasrallah was assassinated. And at the end of all this, we had an agreement between the sides. That agreement included that Israel would maintain certain positions in southern Lebanon. These Lebanese military would go in and disarm Hezbollah south of the Litani River. The Litani River, I'm not sure if it appears on this map. It's a little bit hard to see. It's a little bit over here, the Litani River. Hezbollah would be disarmed anywhere south of the Litani River that's close to the Israeli border. Hezbollah would also agree to move north of the Litani River. And during this time, the Lebanese military would deploy in southern Lebanon, and after this happens, the Israeli military would withdraw. They also established a mechanism to work out any disagreements between the sides, and also said the agreement that Israel has the right to carry out militant actions in Lebanon in order to neutralize any imminent threat. Since then, there were constant violations of the agreement. The Israeli military carried out, I would say, almost weekly, several times a week, airstrikes throughout Lebanon and southern Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah operatives. Hezbollah was constantly trying to rearm itself and redeploy itself in southern Lebanon. And the Lebanese military did deploy in southern Lebanon, but it did so at a much slower pace than was expected. So each side was responsible for certain amounts of violations. Then, several months ago, the United States leveled a lot of pressure at the Lebanese government to move forward with the agreement. And the Lebanese parliament actually did pass a resolution saying that the Lebanese military will disarm Hezbollah, and that the Lebanese military is supposed to present a timetable as to when this is going to happen and how this is going to happen. Since then, within internal politics in Lebanon, we started to have a lot more escalation. Hezbollah started to slightly threaten the Lebanese military, and essentially it ended up with what I would call somewhat of a game of chicken between the sides, with Hezbollah saying, this may lead us to civil war, do you really want to go there? And the Lebanese military saying, this may lead us to civil war, do you really want to go there? And then, alongside this, Hezbollah tried to increase its weapons smuggling into Lebanon. This past week, everything boiled over. On October 28th of this past week, on Tuesday, Israel reported to the United States and to the negotiating mechanism that it has proof that Hezbollah has been smuggling hundreds of medium to long-range missiles and rockets into Lebanon, and showed proof of this. This was presented to the Lebanese government and shown to be a major violation of the agreement. This caused internal political strife in Lebanon. And on October 31st, on Friday, the Lebanese president, Alon, officially informed the negotiating countries that the Lebanese military does not have the capability to disarm Hezbollah by force. And it said that such an attempt would lead to civil war and that he's not willing to do this. So Lebanon officially declared it cannot live up to its side of disarming Hezbollah by force. The United States issued very, very disappointing statements in Lebanon. It said that this is a letdown, that Lebanon is missing an opportunity to bring about a better future for itself. Sky News in Arabic quoted sources, U.S. sources, stating that the refusal to engage with Hezbollah is going to endanger Lebanon's future, and that Lebanon is going to be left up to its own devices, that Israel will do whatever it sees necessary to disarm Hezbollah, and the United States is not going to try to stop them. The U.S. Special Envoy to the region, dealing with this, postponed his trip to Lebanon and said there's no point in my going there if Lebanon's not going to live up to its agreement. It seemed that things are teetering on the brink of complete collapse. That same day, on October 31st, the Israeli military also carried out an unusual offensive in southern Lebanon. Like I said, the Israeli military still holds 5 positions in southern Lebanon. Most of the time carries out airstrikes. However, carried out the ground offensive in the village of Bleda, it invaded the municipality in that area and killed a municipal worker. There's conflicting reports as to the circumstances. The Israeli military said that it went after that area to destroy Hezbollah infrastructure, and it killed someone who was a threat to the Israeli forces. In Lebanon, in turn, it was reported that that worker was asleep when he was killed in the municipality building. Whatever it is, this was an unusual event, and it's contributed to the political strife in Lebanon, as the Lebanese president also said that Israel is now violating the agreement, and the Lebanese military should not necessarily have withdrawn and allowed the Israeli military to carry out that operation. So, as it stands right now, November 1st, the agreement between the sides remains stable, but is on extremely shaky grounds. Lebanon is officially declaring that it's not capable of disarming Hezbollah. Israel is still maintaining positions in southern Lebanon and has increased its airstrikes in Lebanon over the last week, in addition to the last several months. And no one knows where this is going to go at this point. Hezbollah is infinitely weaker compared to where it was at the beginning of the war 2 years ago, but it's far from disappeared. It's far from gone anywhere. So remains to be seen how this actually ends up developing. But at this point, I would say that it's important to keep an eye on the Lebanese front between Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah, in addition to what's going on in the Gaza Strip, because that is another arena that may end up flaring up very quickly. The negotiating countries are all proposing new agreements of what might be. Not going to get into that at this point, but it is one of those things that one should pay attention to when we're looking at the Israel-Palestine arena. With that, I am going to be looking at any more questions that might have come in. Anyone else have any more comments or questions? I thought there was already so Fran asks, I thought there was already a UN resolution that Hezbollah has to stay a certain number of kilometers from the Litani River. Yes, indeed. The UN Security Council Resolution 1701, dating back to 2006, says that Hezbollah will withdraw all of its forces north of the Litani River. Hezbollah never pretended to even live up to this. This led to escalations between the sides and to the complete breakout between the sides in October of 2023. Since then, the difference between the agreement between the sides last year and that resolution is that UN Security Council Resolution 1701 was imposed externally. And Hezbollah said they're not going to live up to it, so be it. The agreement between the sides last year was an agreement between Israel and Lebanon. That already puts Hezbollah in a much more weakened position. It's not something the United Nations is imposing on Lebanon. The Lebanese government agreed that Hezbollah will not have a presence there. So that put Hezbollah under a lot more pressure, and also with a weakened position that Hezbollah was in last year, this contributed to Hezbollah pretending for a long time that it was going to withdraw to north of the Litani River. Now they're using a different rhetoric. Remains to be seen how that actually develops. Anything else? Any other questions, things that you are curious about that I have missed that I can help elucidate about this conflict? Another question. Lebanese President Alon may be acting out of self-preservation. Is it possible that he will act under the table to keep Hezbollah in check? Yes, it is very possible. However, within the Lebanese governing apparatus, Nabih Berri is also a representative of Amal, which is a close ally of Hezbollah. He is the Speaker of the House. And Hezbollah, while it is very weakened militarily, still has a lot of political presence within the Lebanese government. So it is possible that Alon wants things to happen under the table, but not publicly. However, without the support of the United States gave upwards of $250 billion to the Lebanese military over the years. Without the support of the United States and without the support of international actors, if he is not saying that he's going to do this, it'll be a lot harder for him to do this internally. So I'd find it surprising if he would be willing to risk the international support, but still hope to do this under the table, because all he will have done then is weaken the Lebanese military with regards to financial support, international support, military support, etc., that they might have used in order to actually disarm Hezbollah as time goes on. Anything else? Okay, so with that, I went a little bit longer than I usually try to go, and apologies for that. Thank you for all the comments also about the setup and the lighting. I promise I will look through them and try to implement any of them. If you have any other questions or comments, do feel free to send them on in the chats or to send them in any comments on YouTube later on. Like I said, I'm going to put out a special video, hopefully in the coming week, where I'm going to look at terminology, looking at things like hostages versus Palestinian prisoners versus detainees. Might also look at something that I get a lot of comments on, the wording of the West Bank versus Judea and Samaria, and why I do call it the West Bank, and things like that. So I'm hoping to do that in the coming week. If you'd like me to relate to anything else specifically, again, feel free to send me a message. One more thing I'm going to say before I sign off is, in the coming week, I'm going to be developing a Google form in which I'm going to ask for your emails. I'm going to have a newsletter that I'm going to send out, hopefully once a week, just letting you know what videos are going to come up or what lives are coming up or if there's any special events. So if you would like to sign up for that, again, feel free to sign on to my next live event or look at my channel, and I'm hoping to have that form up. You can look on YouTube, and I'll have a link to that on my channel. Otherwise, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to send them on. If anyone is missed, just as one final spiel, my name is Alon Burstein. I am a visiting assistant professor and Israel Institute Fellow in the Department of Political Science at Tufts University. This channel that you're watching is the Israel-Palestine Report. Hit that subscribe button, and let's dive into these topics. Thank you all for the lovely comments. I promise I will look through all of the suggestions. With that, I am now signing off. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. And if anyone, don't forget to change your clocks, and happy Halloween to those who are still celebrating into the weekend.